But anyway, back to the Federal Reserve thing. I don't really think that these guys in the beginning considered themselves to be con artists, because they fought their way up the up the mountain of competition to get where they were. Most of them were or at least their fathers were the product of the free enterprise system. But after they got there on the top, they realized that the free enterprise system had to go if they wanted to stay on top. So, after that point was reached and they wanted to fool the public into thinking something that wasn't true, then they and the ones who followed them became con artists, because those are the kinds of people that would succeed in delivering that kind of a deceptive message. I could go on on that. Maybe that's something we should talk about today. But I think in the beginning, I guess where I was going with that is, in the very beginning, I think these bankers really were all about money and power, and they were more concerned with manipulating politicians than being politicians. They found out how to buy politicians, how to influence them, how to control them. Maybe that's still the case. But the politicians themselves, I think, by that time probably were already pretty well down the road of being graduates of the University of Caen. Caen University. You look back at some of the speeches that were given at that time, and these guys were just orators, and they spoke about the great American tradition. Hell, even Abraham Lincoln was already resorting to some of the rhetoric to accomplish political objectives, and it sounds so good today. It sounds so sincere, but when you look at even his career, everybody assumes that Abraham Lincoln was one of the great American presidents, which I don't, but anyway, he has that aura, that image. I think already these guys were learning that rhetoric is more important for their careers than substance. So by the time you get on to 1913, 1910, I mean, that process was traveled much further, and the craft was perfected. I'm not aware of any events or meetings where that kind of thing was discussed. Probably was discussed, but I don't know whether it was a big meeting or whether it was discussed over private dining tables or on yachts, things like that. I know J.P. Morgan used his yacht a lot for business meetings of that kind, and but that was unofficial. He had his mistress with him, and God only knows how many of these other guys had their mistresses or short-term substitutes thereof for that. I know there was a lot of drinking and partying going on, but obviously the record of those things did not survive very far into history. So anyway, I'm going to guess that the kind of things you mentioned were probably not done officially at meetings, but were done over a period of time, and done in very small private groups. That would be my guess. I think Quigley addressed that issue in his book Tragedy and Hope, and he talked about conferences between the various banking interests, and international groups would hold conferences. But then he also, as I remember without seeing the quote in front of me, said, and private meetings. Without defining what private meetings meant, we're free to interpret that any way we wish, but it certainly wasn't a conference where people came from all over the world and they checked into a hotel and they met for 3 or 4 days or that kind of thing. Probably just very private meetings. Kind of what goes on today, I think, in Switzerland at the in Basel at the what do they call that thing? The Bank of International Settlements. There, once in a while, I've seen an announcement in the news that there was a meeting, an official meeting, of the members of the Bank of International Settlements. But more often, I'm apt to find statements in the press about some important figure having gone there, but there was no meeting. He just took a trip there. I guess I guess just to familiarize himself with the topography. But no, he went there obviously for a meeting, but it made it sound like he just visited alma mater or something like that. I guess the short and honest answer to your question is I don't know. I'm just guessing based on background information. But we know one thing for sure. They had meetings all the time. These things don't just happen. I guess it was FDR that said, in politics, there's no such thing as a coincidence. Yeah, I don't know quite how to begin this, except I'm not used to doing these kinds of things by Skype, but I guess it's the time to get with the modern way of doing things. So it's a learning experience for me. So, but I thought I would just talk about some issues that I wrote down on a piece of paper here earlier today, just as though everybody was right here in my room, sitting around my coffee table and drinking a cup of coffee. So that's kind of the attitude I thought I would hold in this series, and I hope it carries okay for you. First of all, I just want to thank you for inviting me. I know it was mentioned that I was a great guy because I didn't charge anything. Well, I know that you fellas are digging for money out of the bottoms of your boots, and everybody is donating their time in this movement, and it's not about money. And I was just glad that even though I couldn't make the trip to attend your conference, I was glad that that I could participate in this way, especially with the thought that the video might be broadcast and people are watching it all around the world, or at least all around the US, and it'll be recorded and people will see it in the future. So I'm honored to be here, and thank you for that opportunity. And I don't really have a carefully prepared speech to bore you with. I have a sloppily prepared speech to bore you with. And I hope I can touch on some topics that are germane to not only what's going on in the world, but to the purpose of your meeting there. Now, I know that it was expected that I would talk primarily about the Federal Reserve System because of my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. And I had a little trouble with that last night as I was thinking about what I would cover today, because I thought, you know, this is a meeting that is not necessarily an educational meeting. It's not a meeting that is aimed at enlightening people about what's going on in the world. It's a meeting of people who already know pretty much what's going on in the world, and they don't like it very much. And I had a feeling that maybe the interest now is not, hey, let's not talk so much about what is going on in the world that we don't like, and what's wrong with this and what's wrong with that, and blah, blah, blah. We might talk about analyzing why these things are going on, and then talk about solutions to them. And especially, I thought if I could relate that concept to the general topic of political parties, that would be probably of more use in the long run, at least, than talking about the Federal Reserve. But nevertheless, my assigned topic was the Federal Reserve, so I thought I would take maybe a minute or two, or 3 minutes, to just summarize it. It is easy to do. The Federal Reserve System is a scam. Any questions? Yeah, that's it. Well, I think everybody knows that it is a scam, but a lot of people don't know that. They say, well, yeah, we know there's some things going wrong there at the Federal Reserve, and we read the newspaper all the time how the banks are being fined $50 billion for some crimes they committed against investors and so forth. Yeah, but it's a good thing we got those banks in line now. We hit them with a big bill, $50 billion, right? That'll put them in their place. And what they don't realize is that, hey, that's just the cost of doing business for those boys. They pay a fine of $50 billion in return for the privilege of skimming $50 billion, $150 billion, $500 billion. 10 times, 100 times more, skimming that off of the people of the world, particularly the citizens of their own respective countries. And the money that is paid by these banks in the fines, it doesn't go to the people who were injured. It doesn't go to the investors, although they try to set up some programs now and then and make it look like it's going to be redistributed and somehow find its way back to the people who were injured. But when you follow that money trail, it's a very weak trail. It's overgrown with weeds. I mean, for every $100 that's been stolen from the people, there might be 2 cents that winds its way back to the people who were actually injured. So that's there primarily for publicity and for show. And the point is that the money goes to the government, doesn't it? Oh, well, the fine is paid to the government. Well, no wonder the agents of the government and the regulatory agencies of the government are not interested in prosecuting any of these bankers, because all they want to do is just level a fine. And they want those guys around so they can commit another crime next year that they can fine them for, and keep those fines going every year, because it's a great source of income to the federal government, all the while making it look like, to the public, make it look like they're really doing the job and cranking down on the banks. So furthermore, the fine is usually covered by the government itself, because the banks say, hey, we're running out of money, and so the government comes along and bails them out and gives them the money to pay the fines. And the important thing is that any of the fines that comes from the banking assets themselves, that money is paid not by the managers or the executives of the banks who committed the crimes, but it's paid by the stockholders who were totally innocent of the crime. It just means that the dividends are reduced a little bit. And that's where the money comes from. And the people who committed the crimes and knowingly did this get off scot-free. They're never prosecuted. They're never fined themselves. In fact, they usually get a nice fat bonus, and they're on their way to the next crime for the next year, another big $50 billion fine paid to the federal government. And this thing goes on and on and on. And the only reason it's allowed to continue is because the people don't really understand that it is a scam. The whole thing is orchestrated by the Federal Reserve. We must understand that the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a cartel. And once you understand that, and you understand what a cartel is, then everything that happens under the umbrella of the Federal Reserve makes a lot of sense. All cartels are pretty much the same. The Federal Reserve being a cartel is no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. It just happens to be a banking cartel. And all cartels have one primary purpose, and that's to promote the benefit of the members of the cartel, period. That's it. And in this case, they have to talk a lot about benefiting the economy, helping employment, fighting inflation. They have to use all these phrases in order to keep the public more or less content with the fact that everything is going wrong, because the public will think, well, these guys are doing their best, at least. Because look, did you hear that wonderful speech that the chairman of the Fed just made? They're doing everything they can do to fight inflation. So I guess it's not their fault, because they're fighting inflation. If they were really fighting inflation, that it couldn't be their fault that we have inflation, right? And that's the kind of childish thinking that most people have about the Fed. So back to my statement, the Fed is a cartel. It's a banking cartel. It was given back in 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act was passed. It was given the power to create the nation's money supply. Wow, what a deal. I mean, that's normally a privilege that is reserved by the governments to issue their own money. But when you analyze what happened with the creation of the Federal Reserve, the charter took that power from the government, and the congressmen and senators delegated it to a private banking cartel. So now the banks themselves issue the nation's money. It looks like the old money somewhat did. It's got a lot of fancy engraving on it. It has pictures of dead presidents on it. But if you notice, it says Federal Reserve Note. It's a Federal Reserve note. It's Federal Reserve money. It's issued by the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel. So once you get those couple of simple facts in your mind, then everything that is normally so confusing about the Federal Reserve suddenly makes a lot of sense. When you pick up your newspaper and you see that the Federal Reserve has just authorized, or Congress has just authorized under the recommendation of the Federal Reserve, the creation of $100 billion, and they're going to bail out the banks. or they're going to bail out some large corporation that is going bankrupt and is about to default on its loan to the banks. So the government steps up and they just take taxpayer money, and they either give it directly to the banks to help them directly, or they give this money to a borrower who is about to go belly up. So the borrower can continue to send interest payments to the bank and thereby keep the bank alive. Everything, once you look at it, all this money flows eventually to the banks. And you might say, well, how come all this money is going to the banks? Duh. Remember, the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel. What more do you need to know than that, you see? But most people cannot conceive that something as gigantic and official as the Federal Reserve System could be a scam. They just can't believe it. They say, how could this be a scam? This is my country. This is America. We don't have scams in our government, do we? Well, yes, we do. So in a nutshell, that's everything that I think people need to know about the Federal Reserve. And once you understand that it is rotten to the core, it's a means of legally plundering the American people without them even knowing it. It's the engine of inflation. It's a means of taking our savings away from us over a lifetime. And once you understand it's a means of destroying the middle class and redistributing the wealth up to the super upper class, once you understand it's a means of destroying the basic system upon which this country was based, and putting it back into an oligarchy, the kind of almost a monarchy, the kind of thing that we broke away from in the American Revolution. Once you understand these things, then you understand too why I say we do not need to audit the Fed. We know what the Fed is doing. We don't need an audit. We don't need to audit the Fed. We need to abolish the Fed. You see, if we audit the Fed, we're going to find out that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and that is to plunder the American people. So there's my whole presentation on the Federal Reserve. We could probably talk about it for hours and hours. But I understand we're going to have a Q&A period at the end of this, so maybe it leaves a few things open and we can come back to that. So I'd like to move on now to these other issues. A moment ago, I said that the people at your meeting and the people who will be watching this video now and in the future primarily are those who understand what I just said, and they understand that we have very serious economic, social, and political issues, particularly in America, but all around the world. And they're concerned about it. But there's a lot of confusion I've seen among concerned people as to what is the cause of these problems. Yes, we understand we've got destruction of the money supply. We understand we've got a Federal Reserve System that is a scam. We understand that we have an immigration problem. We understand now that we're getting forced vaccinations that many people feel very, very dangerous health-wise. It's certainly against the concept of freedom of choice. It's a lot of things wrong with it. And you go on down the list. We could probably take an hour and just make a list of all of the things that are going not well, let's put it mildly. And we want to do something about it. So we need to know, however, why these things are happening. I discovered a long time ago that there is a reason, a common reason, a commonality behind almost all of the things that concern us today. And it's not that we have bad men in office. It's not that we have crooks in office or con men in office, although we do. But that is not the cause of the problem. That is the result of the problem. I believe that the problem is an idea. It's an idea, I'll call it idea X. In fact, I want to talk to you today about two ideas. One, let's say, is idea X, and the other one is idea Z. The first one is idea X, and it's a concept. Technically, the correct word is it's an ideology. It has a name. Most people in the world today believe in it. They've never heard its name, most people. If they did hear it, they had no idea how to define it, and yet they have internalized this idea. I was taught it in school. You were taught it in school. It permeates all of our textbooks. It permeates every law that is passed by our governments. It is in the airwaves. It is in the tax-exempt foundations. It is everywhere we look, and nobody, it seems, or very few people, challenge it. They think it is the ideal. And the name of this idea X is collectivism. Now, what is that all about? Collectivism, that seems like kind of a funny word. I was surprised to find out that about 80 years ago, or 100 years ago, the word collectivism was a very commonly used word. I find it in all of the old books that I've gone to that relate to political and social economic issues. The word collectivism was in the language, was in the English language, everywhere you looked. But I found out that, after I went to school, went through the university in the 1950s, and that word, no, I'd never heard of the word before. I had to look it up in the encyclopedia to find it. But the word collectivism is an important word because it defines this idea X that has permeated the world. And it is, in my view, the basic root cause behind almost all of the problems we face, including the Federal Reserve. So what is this idea of collectivism? Actually, there are many components to this ideology, but I've isolated 7 of them, which are found quite dramatically found in the writings of all of the collectivist leaders and thinkers of the past couple of centuries. You'll find them in the works of Karl Marx. They're all embedded in communism. You'll find them in Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler. You'll find it behind Nazism. You'll find these concepts in fascism, which Mussolini advanced. You'll find them all advanced by Mao Zedong, Lenin, Stalin. Everywhere you look, if you find a totalitarian system based on ideas rather than bayonets, it is collectivism, and you'll find these 7 ideas all shared by all of these people. So what are those ideas? Well, there are 7 of them, as I said. I was able to find them easily if you look for them and say, oh, that's what Hitler said. Oh, that's what Stalin said. Oh, that's what Bush said. What? Wait a minute, what? That's what Roosevelt said. That's what Mao Zedong said. And I said, this seems strange because some of these people fight each other. And, well, they don't actually fight each other. They send young men onto the battlefield to fight for them, and while they stay pretty safely away from the war zone. But, Hitler fought Stalin. And why? Why would Hitler and Stalin fight? Because you analyze what they believe in, their ideology, communism and Nazism, is identical. It's collectivism. Why would they fight? Well, it's not because they disagreed over ideas. They were fighting over territory. They were fighting over who would be the big cheese, not what kind of cheese it was. They all agreed it had to be a certain kind of cheese, but they wanted to be the big cheese. And that's where you find collectivists today still fighting each other, the left and the right. The so-called left and right, they're the same when you analyze what they believe, but they fight each other over slogans and over the appearance. But when you look underneath it, they believe the same, and they're merely fighting because they want to be the big cheese, and the other guys are going to be forced into second position or third position. You find that in the United Nations today. The countries on the left, the countries on the right, they do not disagree with each other over ideology, but they do disagree and quite often fight each other over dominance. Okay, what are these principles? As I said, there are 7 of them, and you find them in all of these philosophies. I don't want to make this into a 3-day course or anything, so I'm going to just talk briefly about 2 of them and then just summarize the other 5, and we can move on. And if you want to come back to some of these things in the Q&A, if we have time, I'd be happy to discuss them because they're all extremely important. The first of them is very important, and that has to do with the origin of human rights. Where do they come from? And this is a very simple concept. Oh, by the way, I need to tell you that there is an opposite philosophy or ideology. Collectivism, on the one hand, is opposed on every point by another philosophy or ideology called individualism. So what we really have in the world today is a conflict not between socialism and communism, Nazism and fascism, or we don't really have a conflict between Republicans and Democrats, between liberals and conservatives, right wingers and left wingers. All these things are just gobbledygook words. When you look at the underlying ideology, what you have is a conflict between collectivism on the one hand and individualism on the other. Now, these words really have meaning. You can look them up in the dictionary, especially the old ones. They have really definable, substantive meaning. Like all the others, you have to define them over and over again. And somebody will say, well, that's not my definition of socialism, that kind of thing. So you have a constructive opposite, collectivism and individualism. So now we get to this first principle, which is the origin of human rights. The individualist, I consider myself to be an individualist, believes that rights are innate. They're inherent in the individual. Some people say they're given by God, God-given rights. You find that written in the literature, in the American literature, right in our Declaration of Independence, and a lot of authors. These are God-given rights. Others will say, well, I'm not sure whether God gave them to us or not, but they're inherent and they come with us. They're hardwired. When we're born, we have these rights. They're part of us. It's the difference between hardware and software. The software is added to the computer after it's created, but the hardware is the computer. And so the individualist believes that rights are the hardware of the human being. Human beings have those rights. Now, with a qualifying memo, if they can defend them. Those rights can be denied to them by somebody with superior force. So you can say, I've got these rights, but if you're not willing to defend your rights, then you don't have them anymore. They're taken from you by somebody who says, yeah, hold up your Constitution against my automatic rifle and see how many bullets it will stop, you see. But anyway, to concept, we're talking here about philosophical concept, not practice. There is this concept that the individual has inherent, inalienable rights. Now, that's the view of the individualist. The collectivist, on the other hand, says, no. The state grants rights. The state is the source of human rights. And if you're lucky enough, you will live in a system where the government will grant you your rights. And they consider that if the government can give you your rights, of course, they can take them away. Now, you can see evidence of that everywhere in our present society. Almost everyone today sort of believes, without questioning it, that they've got to petition the government for the government to grant them some kind of a right, to put it on a piece of paper and say, okay, we hereby grant you this right to peacefully assemble and so forth, the right to bear arms and so forth, like that. If you look at the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights, so-called, the amendments to the Constitution, they did not, those were not statements of granting rights to the people by the government. Those were statements which were saying that these rights were held by the people in the very beginning, and that the purpose of government was to protect those rights, not to grant them, but to protect them and to guarantee that every citizen in the United States was not denied those rights. You see, it's a very important concept to say these are inherent rights and the purpose of the state is to protect them. Now you go to, let's say, any of these collectivist systems I've mentioned, you go to the Soviet Constitution, you go to the Constitution of Hitler's Third Reich, you go to the Chinese Constitution, you go to the UN Covenant of Human Rights and open up the big book on everything they say about human rights. In all cases, especially the UN, it mentions all these wonderful rights. If you read the UN Draft Covenant on Human Rights, you'll be very impressed by all the rights that they're giving you. It says every man should have the right to practice the trade of his choice. Every man has a right to travel. Every man has a right to practice religion. Actually, it's there. But when you look at those rights and you say, well, that sounds good, but keep reading, don't stop. You get down to the end of the paragraph and it says, except Oh, wait a minute. If you stop reading too soon, you'll you'll miss the word except. Keep reading. Except as may be provided for by law. That's the gimmick in all of the collectivist systems. They are say, we'll grant you these rights. We, the state, grant you, the people, these rights, except as may be provided for by law, which means except until we decide to take them away from you. We'll just simply pass a law and you don't have them anymore. Because if we can give you your rights, we can take them away. Now, there it is in a nutshell. Any child can see that this is a very important issue. It's something that's not taught in schools. You have to really dig it out of the literature to find it. And they say, wow, this is very important, isn't it? And anyway, if an average person would read these collectivist documents like the UN Draft Covenant on Human Rights, if they would read them with just half of the care that they would read a used car sales contract, they would never sign them because it's so obviously filled with gimmicks and loopholes and so forth. By the way, there's another document that the United Nations has published. It's got a big long title. I've forgotten it. But come to our website and you'll see it. Or give me an email and I'll send the exact title to you. It's a big, fat document. It's 8.5 by 11 paper, and you read all this dull literature. And basically what it is, it's a manual on how to pass laws in such a way as to take away human rights. Can you believe that? It's a manual. It's a how-to manual. These bureaucrats at the UN and all around the world, they study this thing. Say, oh, this is how we take away people's rights without them knowing about it. This is how we grant them the rights and then take it away. And it's very carefully worked out procedure. And it's all based on the premise that the state has the power to grant rights, and that rights are not inherent to the individual. Okay, that's just one difference, one of the 7. Now let's the second one, which I think is extremely important. And it's the concept of which is more important, the group or the individual. In fact, that is more or less where these words come from, collectivism versus individualism. Collectivism implies that it's based on the concept of the collective or the group, whereas individualism obviously is based on the one individual. And it's a concept of which is supreme in society. Is it the individual more important or the group more important? Now, I was taught that the group was more important. And when I went to school, the slogan was thrown at me and I thought it sounded good. It was from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And then it came along the good one, which is how did they say it? The individual must be sacrificed. The individual must be sacrificed, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. Now, there you have it. That's the basis of collectivism, one of the 7, that the greater good of the greater number was the ideal objective in society. And therefore, anything can be done. Anything can be done, even sacrificing individuals or large groups of individuals, as long as they're in the minority. You can sacrifice minorities if doing so is for the greater good of the greater number. Now, as I say, I was taught that in school, and it sounded kind of good to me because, after all, isn't that the basis of democracy? You know, greater good for the greater number, majority rules. And now we're coming to another word, democracy, but I'll come back to that in a moment. So let's just examine the concept of this business of the group versus and the individual. The individualist says, what is group? What is group? What is this thing called group? Where is a group? Can you see a group? Can you touch a group? You can't. All you can see are individuals, lots of them, and you can touch individuals, but you can't see a group and you can't touch a group because a group is an abstract idea. It's a mathematical concept. It's held in the mind only. It doesn't exist in reality. It's the concept of 2 or more individuals, but the basic unit is the individual. So there's no such thing as a group, really. And if you say that the group has rights simply because of its mathematical superiority, then you've made a huge mistake, because now you've set in motion a principle that any individual or even large minorities can be eliminated, sacrificed. Uh, they can be, anything can be done to them as long as the leaders of society say, well, too bad about that, but this is in the best interest of society or the greater good of the greater number. Take a lynch mob, for example. Now, there we have democracy in action, the greater good of the greater number, supposedly. We've only got one dissenting vote, and he's at the end of the rope. You say, well, wait a minute, maybe that's true. Maybe majority should not always rule. Why not? Well, because the majority shouldn't rule if the majority decides to use that power to deny the human rights of the individual or the minority. And so now you've got a difference between, classically, what they call the difference between a democracy and a republic. Democracies were recognized by our founding fathers as being a terrible form of government, and they said so. In fact, I dug out a few quotes here. I'll fast forward to them and say, yeah, here's a few quotes I thought you might find interesting if you haven't heard these before. It was Samuel Adams, back in colonial times. Samuel Adams said, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. Now, not just in America, but over in England, you've heard about Lord Acton. Well, he wrote this. He said, the one pervading evil of democracy is the tyranny of the party that succeeds by force or fraud in carrying elections. Boy, does that sound like modern times or not? In Scotland, there was a history professor at the University of Edinburgh. His name was Alexander Tyler. And he wrote this. He said, a democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. Democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always vote for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, usually followed by a dictatorship. Now, if that doesn't describe what's happening in the world today, I don't know what does. And it's because we have adopted one of these principles of collectivism, which is that the group is more important than the individual. And democracy being the highest form of the group, the state, majority, that is what triggers us, and we're on that slippery slope. So there we have two important concepts. And the others, I'll just mention. The third one is the idea of coercion versus freedom. Individualists believe in freedom to choose, but collectivists say that people can't be trusted to make the right choice. You've got to force them to do what is right, because otherwise they'll make mistakes. And we, the collectivists, we've been to school, we've read the books, we're wise, and we'll take care of them. We owe it to society to make these decisions for them. And if they don't make the right decisions, like vaccinating their children, that's the current thing in the news, well, we'll just force them to do it. And if they don't do it, we'll put them in prison. And that's another difference between individualism and collectivism. Another one is property rights. Individualists believe and know that property rights are human rights. Collectivists like to write big, thick books and say property rights are in opposition to human rights. What they miss the point is that property rights are human rights. And if you take away the right of an individual to possess property, especially that which he has created and earned by the sweat of his own brow and his own toil, even if he inherited it, it doesn't make any difference. If people are denied the right to possess property, then they're denied the incentive to be productive, and they're denied one of the basic human qualities that make people human as opposed to animal. In fact, it's more than that, because every advanced species, even starting with things as low as lizards. But by the time you get to birds and to mammals, every one of them has an instinct for possession of property. It's sometimes called the territorial imperative. All animals have that, and it's instinct. And there's a reason for that. We don't have time to go into it, but it's a productive reason. Yes, it can lead to selfishness, but it also can lead to productivity. It can lead to the creation of great surplus, which can help those in need. Um, Successful, wealthy societies. If you're going to live in poverty, if you're going to have be unable to earn a living, you better choose a nice, wealthy society to do that in. Because if you choose some poor society, you're not going to do as well. So even those who cannot afford or are not able to take care of themselves do a lot better in societies where we have the property right protected. It's a very important topic, and that's one of the differences between individualism and collectivism. And now we come to number 5, which is money. Oh, money without coercion. Individualists believe that we should be free to choose whatever we want to for our money. Money is merely a means of exchange. It's something we use in exchange for something else that we can't use. If we were just living in a society with barter, why, we'd be very limited in our economic activities. But if we can use something like gold coins or beer caps or anything, we can use something as a medium of exchange, then economic activity is greatly activated. And historically, we've known, it's been proven every time, when people are free to choose whatever they want to use for money, if they're free to do so, every time they go to either gold or silver, some precious metal. Nobody forces them to do that. It's just that they try everything, and those two are the ones that always come up through experience to serve society the best. Now you get into a collectivist system, however, and the first thing that Mao Zedong and Adolf Hitler and Karl Marx and all the others, and including our own leaders today, first thing they're trying to do is get rid of freedom of choice in money. You've got to accept the state money. It's got to be state money or nothing else. And they pass what they call legal tender laws to require us to use state money, whether we want to or not, no matter how worthless it is, in spite of the fact that the Federal Reserve note since 1913 has lost 98% of its value, literally. We still have to use it or we go to prison. And there again is one of the differences between collectivism and individualism, is that collectivism forces us by law to have no choice in money. We have to use the worthless money always that the collectivist state issues. Finally, we've got equality versus inequality under law. Most people give lip service to equality under law. They think, yeah, that's a good idea. Everybody should be treated equally, right? Except, now we get to that word except where we don't want to treat people equally under law. Maybe we are jealous of people with a lot of wealth. So let's tax those rich so-and-sos. Let's tax them more than I have to pay for taxes. That'll show them. That'll make me more equal. So we don't treat people equally now. All of a sudden, we're trying to restructure society. We want to help this group. We want to benefit this group at the expense of that group. Once we set that in motion, of course, then all the groups start to coalesce and they form lobbying pressure organizations so they can manipulate the votes in Congress or in the Senate, and they can use the law specifically to create inequality. And that, too, is a major difference between collectivism and individualism. And finally, we come to the 7th one, which is kind of a catch-all for the whole thing, is that sometimes you get into a gray area and you don't know, maybe this is okay, maybe it's bad. For example, what if we want to build a road? Well, we could build a road and use the government for it. I believe, however, that the only justification for using the coercive power of government, using the power of the gun and prison, is to protect the life, liberty, and property of the citizens, nothing more. It's an important distinction. Sometimes we do need to protect our lives, our property, and our freedom against aggressive attack. It could be attack from a local criminal or an invading army from overseas. Who knows? That's when we need to use force, and it's legitimized use of force. But should we be allowed to use force against our fellow citizens for any other reason. If we want to make him, let's say, take out a health insurance policy, can we use a gun on our neighbor to force him to save money for his retirement? We can't do that. I can't go to my neighbor and say, I don't like the way you're dealing with your economic affairs. You ought to do better than this. Your family, deserves better than this. And so I'm going to put this gun on you, buddy. And if you don't put at least 10 or 12% away every month, I'm going to put you in prison or I'm going to shoot you. Well, that would be a terrible thing. They'd put me in prison or shoot me for doing that. Everybody would say, yeah, this guy's nuts. And yet we do the same thing when we elect some representative who also lives down the street. It's just another guy like us. Oh, now he's a congressman or he's a city councilman or whatever he is. Oh, he's a big shot. And we say, okay, we want you to put a gun to this guy's head and force him to save his money. Now, we can't do that ourselves, but we're delegating this power, which we do not have, delegating it to you. You see the illogic of that. There's no logic behind it. Once the state starts to do something like that, using the coercive power of the state for something other than the defense of life, liberty, and property, now the state is just taking this power of its own. It's just pulling it out of thin air like any tyrant would do, any emperor, any king, any dictator, that I do it because I can do it. That's the only thing that's behind it. So there you have it. That's the proper role of the state then, is if you're in doubt, the only time you should use coercive power is some people call it the non-aggression principle. You can use it in defense only, but not aggressive purposes. Now, 7 very important and really pretty simple concepts that need to be taught to every child in a free society. These are not taught to us they were, most of them at one time, by the way, but they've all been cleared out now because we go to government schools. And government schools do not want us to think this way. They want us to think that collectivism is the ideal form of the state and that we should, consider society as being above individuals. Individuals should serve the state should not serve individuals, and all that sort of thing. Okay, both the left and the right around the world, and particularly in the United States, are totally on board with collectivism. Now, they may fight each other, the right wing, the left wing, the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, I don't care. They may fight each other over many sub-issues. But when it comes to these things that I've been describing, there is no disagreement between them whatsoever. They compete with each other only because of supremacy. It's they want to be the big cheese and not the other guy. What does this mean for us? And I have a note here, significance here, is that the rulers of America have all clustered around an organization called the CFR. I know you folks know what the CFR is. It's Council on Foreign Relations. And it's a kind of a think tank, but it's much more than that. It only has about 4,000 people in its membership. But if you look in the power centers of society, by that I mean the political parties, the major corporations, the news media, major newspapers, the network, the communication channels, the cable companies, the universities, the think tanks, labor unions, all of these major organizations. And you look at the heads. On the board of directors, you're going to find a couple of people on the Council on Foreign Relations. And in many cases, the executive officer or the vice presidents are loaded, all from this one little group, 4,000 people. They literally dominate all the important power centers of America. That is not a coincidence. This is according to plan. It's been well laid out decades ago. And they even talk about it. It's no mystery. I'm not inventing this. You can read their own documents where they talk about it. And they use both political parties, both major political parties, as an instrument to accomplish control. You see, the objective is how do you but let me back up. Yeah, I know you folks are well informed on this thing, so I have a tendency to just speak as though I don't need to explain it, but I know that somebody might be looking in that doesn't know what I'm talking about, and I'm not making it very good for them to figure it out unless I back up a little bit. So, backing up, there's a guy by the name of Professor Carroll Quigley who wrote a couple of books, and one of his most famous books books. It was called Tragedy and Hope. Big, thick book, almost as big as, well, in fact, bigger and thicker than mine. But it's a very important book, Tragedy and Hope. Now, Quigley was a professor at Georgetown University. He was one of the teachers of Bill Clinton, by the way, when Clinton was a student there. And he sort of took Clinton under his wing and introduced him to the people at the Rhodes Scholarship. And probably Quigley was one of the major people in launching Bill Clinton on his political career. Clinton acknowledged Quigley several times after he was elected president. In several speeches, he mentioned his professor at Georgetown, and he thanked him for the enlightenment he received from Professor Carroll Quigley. Okay, so that's Quigley. So why is Quigley important? Well, he wrote this big book I mentioned, Tragedy and Hope, and another one is called The Anglo-American Establishment, I believe. And these books were the history, a very scholarly history of one of the biggest conspiracies of all history. One of the biggest conspiracies of all history, and one that exists today and is still functioning now. And this is the history of it. And it's important, therefore, to understand why Quigley and Clinton were so close together, because this really, what Quigley was talking about, it was the creation of a secret organization that was the brainchild and funded by Cecil Rhodes. Yes, Cecil Rhodes from the British Empire. One of the most wealthy men in the world, had controlled most of the minerals and other resources of South Africa at one time. One of the most fabulously wealthy people of the world. People have heard about him, but they didn't. Most people don't know that when he died, when Cecil Rhodes died, he left his fantastic estate not to his heirs, but to create and fund a secret society. Now, it was so secret that they deliberately chose not to give it a name. It was a decision they made. Let's not give our organization a name, because then people could talk about it. If it doesn't have a name, it's difficult to talk about it, which is why Quigley himself, in writing about it, just calls it the group or the Rhodes organization, things like that. So anyway, the reason I'm giving you that background is to let you in on a little peek on the fact that this is big, big stuff. This is big because he's talking about a very influential group that is still active today. It's a group which Quigley said he was a part of. He was never an official member, but he was invited into their inner circles, he said, and it was allowed to analyze and read their private papers, which is what he used as a source for writing the history of this organization ever since about World War I on through to the present time. Now, with that as a very brief and inadequate introduction to Quigley and what the purpose of this organization is, let me read to you a passage taken from his book, Tragedy and Hope. Quigley raises the question. He says, okay, we, the elitists, have the responsibility to direct the world. And in this world where people have the expectation of democracy, they really expect to be masters of their own political destiny. They want the vote. How do we let these people participate in democracy and in the vote, at the same time not allow them to accomplish anything without them getting wise to it? How do we let them go through their little charade of voting and participating in what they think is their own political destiny, but meanwhile, we, the elitists, from behind the scenes, will continue to make all the important decisions? How do we do that? That's the question. And then he answers it. And he says, it's easy. All we have to do is control two political parties. We'll control them both, let them fight each other, and give the stupid masses a chance to choose up between one or the other. And they can go back and forth, back and forth. And if they don't like one and they find out that that one is corrupt, then they can jump ship and go over to the other one and let them jump ship and back and forth like tennis balls in a tennis game, back and forth, back across the net. As long as we control both parties, it makes no difference. And he said, that's how we're going to do it. Now, am I making this up? I don't think so. I'd like to read to you what Quigley himself said on this topic. And he says this: the national parties and their presidential candidates moved closer together and nearly met in the center with almost identical candidates and platforms, although the process was concealed as much as possible by the revival of obsolescent or meaningless war cries and slogans, often going back to the Civil War. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extreme shifts in policy. Either party in office becomes in time corrupt, tired, unenterprising, and vigorless. Then it should be possible to replace it every 4 years, if necessary, by the other party, which will be none of these things, but will still pursue with new vigor approximately the same basic policy. End quote. Well, is this what we see in reality today? Of course it is. We've seen this, well, really ever since World War I, and it's been increasing in momentum ever since. By the time World War II came along, it was almost total, and we have had no relief from it ever since. But I have to tell you, most people don't know anything about this. I didn't. I came through school, came out of the university, participated in my own political destiny, I thought. I chose between Republicans and Democrats. I voted for the lesser of two evils, usually, is what I thought I was doing. But I was jumping across the ping pong net, just like Quigley was talking about. Now, what are these basic policies that will go unchanged? Well, they're basically the policies of national sovereignty and money. It all boils down to those two categories. In case you haven't noticed, as people from the Council on Foreign Relations and all these critical power centers of society have every year been whittling away on a sovereignty. They're at war with American sovereignty, and they're getting rid of America as an independent nation. That is their objective. And both major political parties have solidly been behind that program. In fact, the candidates for neither of the major political parties will ever discuss this. You've never heard this issue of American sovereignty being discussed at any depth, at least, in the position statements of any of the major candidates. They just will not do it, because if they did, you would find out that there was no difference between those in the Republican Party and those in the Democrat Party. And the other issue is money. You will not find either of the political parties taking a position against fiat money, taking a position against the Federal Reserve System. They will not do it because, as Quigley said, you can jump back and forth across the net. You can go from one party to the other, but you will not change the basic policies by doing that. So what can be done? Here we come to the end of this. What can be done? Well, to solve these problems, we must understand what the cause is. The cause is an idea X, and it's rampant in both major political parties. It's not the leftists or the rightists or the Democrats or the Republicans. It's not liberals or conservatives. Conservatives, it's just individualists versus collectivists. So that's our enemy, and we have to understand that if we expect to really do more than just beat our heads against a brick wall and feel good about what we're doing. If these words sound familiar to you, individualism versus collectivism, I urge you to come to our Freedom Force website. I was given a go-ahead earlier to talk just for a second or two about Freedom Force. I formed that organization back in, I guess it was 2002. And it's an organization, I urge you to look us up on the internet, designed to do something about it. We educate on the principles of individualism versus collectivism, and we go beyond that to develop strategies and tactics to show people how to overcome the present system in a free society. That's all I'm going to say, except if you want to learn more about that and see how I think at least we can overcome this problem, you'll find everything you want to know at freedomforceinternational.org. That's freedomforceinternational.org. We have a new website that's being developed right now, and I urge you to, until it's fully developed, to just type in wp.freedomforceinternational.org, and you'll see everything you need to know about that. So how does this relate to the American Independent Party? And now I'm going to close with this. Is what I'm saying an argument against political parties, all political parties in general? Well, possibly. Some people could say yes. In fact, our founding fathers said yes. They said that political parties were something that much to be avoided, that they always lead to this kind of thing. And they warned us against the passions of political party. But it also could be an argument against an idea Z, which I want to introduce in closing. Idea Z is that people like political parties. And maybe if we come up with a political party that is not based on issues or on the moving whims of passion, and if we state our principles and we come on full square that we believe in the principles of individualism, and we're not going to change on that, wouldn't this be a great idea? Could idea X then be even stronger? I mean, could idea Z, could idea Z then be even stronger than idea X? And that is what I'm here to advocate to you today. That's it, and thanks for listening.
Ed, thank you very much. You're, as always, you're very gracious, and we just really appreciate you sharing your time with us. And we are running a little behind, so our next speaker and stuff, but we just want to thank you and appreciate you a whole bunch, guy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You're very welcome.